Ashel began to stare at Cyan with a penetrating look and asked him again if he had received anything that day. Cyan remained calm, began to observe him, and as a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek, he started to smile and realized that this was not an investigation but that he was trying to create a scapegoat. Suddenly he began to pretend, saying that his head hurt. With a suspicious look, Ashel thought this was not good. Cyan put his hand on top of his head and started to pretend even more. Seeing this, Alice stood up, panicked, grabbed him by the arm and asked if he was okay. He apologized to her and explained that he still did not feel better. Ashel began to observe Cyan and fell silent. Alice placed one hand on his shoulder, the other on top of his chest, turned towards Ashel, and she explained that he had lost a lot of blood, adding that the doctor had said that he also needed rest. Cyan closed his eyes and told them that he felt a little dizzy. She asked Cyan not to strain himself and advised him to lie down for a while to rest. Upon hearing this, he replied with an understood. Ashel turned his head away, looked away, and decided to leave now, asking Cyan to rest a bit. Just before Ashel could leave, Cyan caught his attention and told him that he did not remember having received anything during the banquet. Upon hearing this, Ashel became alert and began to turn around. Alice helped Cyan to sit on the bed, and he explained to him that even if someone tried, he was sure that they could not have survived that hellish situation. Ashel put his hands in his trouser pockets and stood listening silently. Then, he turned his head towards him, began to look at him with a calm gaze, and with a smile thanked him for the answer. Deep down he thought this was true, since the monsters could have killed them. Cyan sat on the bed, put on the blanket, and prepared to rest for a bit. Ashel left his room and started looking at the floor. This was enough for him, since there was no one else left to eliminate. He began to rage like a madman, since for him this was a shame, as he hoped this would be his opportunity to get rid of Cyan. Cyan's eyes began to shine, and he started observing Ashel with a look full of hatred. While he was distracted, with a worried look, Alice, who was sitting next to him, caught his attention. Upon hearing her voice, he came out of his trance and turned his head towards her. Alice got angry and slapped him hard on the back, asking him to listen to his sister and go to bed once and for all. Feeling pain in the wound he had on his back, he began to scream in agony. At the same time, a maid fell to the ground and began to bleed. A man wearing black boots began approaching the maid. While she was lying on the floor bleeding, she asked him why he was doing this. She had a deep cut in her abdomen and another on her face. While she had one hand resting on the ground, she placed the other on the wound in her abdomen, began to cry, and with a sincere look explained that she had done what they had told her. She had been the one who had given the necklace to Princess Erin. She panicked and with a nervous look mentioned that she would never know what the necklace was for, so she asked him to please spare her life. The man brought his sword close to her neck and told her that she had fulfilled her role. This man was none other than Boris. While his body was surrounded by a sinister energy, he began to look at the maid and with a smile explained that unfortunately he still had to do his part, so for this reason, he was doing this. He began to stare at her with a look full of rage. The more he thought about it, the more unpleasant everything became, since he had prepared very well for everything. He swung the sword precisely and attacked the maid, causing a splash of blood. In a matter of seconds, she lost her life and her body fell to the ground. Boris turned his back on her, and as he was walking away he asked her to rest in peace. At that moment, he stopped walking because he had almost forgotten. He reached out towards the ceiling and a book made of red mana appeared. They had found a corpse last time. It could have been bad. He needed to make sure that did not happen again. A monster with lots of eyes and many mouths appeared behind him. While he was controlling the book with one hand and holding the sword with the other, he began looking at the maid's corpse and with a smile ordered it to devour her. At the same time, somewhere else in the city, the sun rose and a woman sat on a bench and began to hum. While she was enjoying the scenery, a man carrying a sword appeared behind her and clenched his fist tightly. This person was Emily. Feeling the presence of the man, she began to turn her head back, and with a serene look, she started to wonder what was happening. The man was holding a bag full of apples. He began to take off his hood and with a smile caught her attention. This man was none other than Brian. He began to approach her and with a smile explained that he had picked some apples from the village. Emily closed her eyes, gave him a thumbs up and with a smile thanked him, adding that this was very kind of him. She took the apple and bit into it. Brian sat on the bench next to her, and while she was eating he told her that the weather felt very nice. She asked him how long they had to stay here. Brian, who was holding the apple with one hand, took another bite and explained to her that they had to stay here until Cyan said otherwise. Emily began to bring the apple closer to her mouth, started looking at him and thought that this could not be predicted. The day before, Emily gave him the ribbon that Ashel wanted to give him. While he was holding the ribbon in his hand, he asked her if it had been a gift from Ashel, to which she replied yes, adding that it was to congratulate him on his first event of his society. The ribbon began to release a powerful and intense evil mana. Cyan began to stare at the ribbon, clenched his teeth tightly and realized that Ashel had tried to make it as complicated as he could. He began to insert the black fog into the ribbon, and it gradually began to disintegrate. Emily approached him. She put her hands near her mouth and couldn't help but go into shock when she saw that he had destroyed Ashel's precious gift. While little by little the black fog was consuming the ribbon, Cyan began to observe it, and with a calm look asked Emily to listen carefully to what he had to say. He revealed to her that the palace and Vert mansion were no longer a safe place for her, so he asked her to stay hidden until he said otherwise. Emily was somewhat confused, but still remained silent without interrupting. Behind them was Nana, who was somewhat injured and tired. While Brian was cleaning the blood on her face with a handkerchief, Cyan caught his attention upon hearing his voice. He began to look at him with a confused expression and asked him what he wanted. Cyan slightly turned his head back and with a serious look explained that he had important matters to attend to, so he entrusted him with the task of protecting Emily. Brian asked him not to worry since he was going to take care of protecting Emily. Cyan approached Nana, placed his hand on her head, and asked Brian to protect her too. Feeling his hand, she couldn't help but be shocked and go on alert at the same time. Cyan removed his hand from her head, closed his eyes, and with a pleasant smile explained to her that this was only for a while, and also asked her not to cry. Back to the present, Brian, who was eating the apple, became serious since he had never seen Cyan make that face before. He needed to make sure that he could support him this time. Emily, who was holding the apple with one hand, turned her head towards him and with a calm look asked him if Nana was okay, to which he replied that she had been having a hard time for a few days but that now she was fine. The house in which they were staying was quite far from the city. Emily soon realized that many things had happened with Cyan while she was not there. Inside the house was Nana sleeping like a log. Emily had never imagined that the girl she thought was a maid would be a draconic human. She decided to help as much as she could now that she knew. Brian turned to her and told her he was thinking the same thing, leaving her somewhat confused. He began to remember the moment when she had grabbed his arm. Remembering this, he couldn't help but start blushing. Then, he began to recall the moment when they were together and he didn't know why suddenly he was remembering that moment. Emily, who was holding the apple with one hand, began to look into Brian's eyes and with a smile decided to do their best to help Cyan. Feeling her gaze, he couldn't help but start blushing and became paralyzed. Several seconds later, he began to smile and decided to listen to her. At the same time in the palace, Lionel went to his father's office, reached back with his hand, and with an angry look started shouting, asking what he meant by this. They had clear and compelling evidence, yet his father still wanted to let the suspects go. The king, who was facing away, asked Lionel to watch his words, as he had already made a decision. Lionel clenched his teeth and fist tightly, began to look at the king with a gaze full of rage and remained thinking in silence. He lost his composure, began to scream and asked the king how he was going to take over the reign on the continent being so weak. He did not know what the hell he was afraid of from the kingdom of Garam. The king decided to do something about it and just before he could finish speaking, he launched a powerful golden ray which struck the wall behind them. Lionel couldn't help but feel afraid. As the golden energy was slowly disappearing, the king, who had an outstretched hand towards Lionel, began to look at the ground and explained that although reigning over the continent was a good goal, the Ushif Empire shared a border not only with the Garam Kingdom, but also with the Demon Kingdom, as well as Sparnia and Fruina. He began to stare intently at Lionel, clenched his teeth tightly and revealed that if they became enemies of Garam Kingdom, then they would no longer be able to contain the Demon Kingdom. All of the continent would suffer from all of monsters that would come out from there. Lionel began to look at the king with a gaze full of hatred and remained silent. If the king could somehow gain power over the continent, that was going to sacrifice too many people. With a serious look, the king began to shout and told him that someone who did such a thing was a monster, not an emperor, asking him if he wasn't even aware of that common sense. Lionel approached him and explained that letting go of suspects when they had clear evidence was foolish. Just before he could finish the sentence, the king asked him if he was talking about the day's stone. Hearing this, Lionel was perplexed and began to sweat. He did not know how the king knew about this. According to him, his people should not have finished the research yet. The king turned around and with a calm look revealed to him that his face said it all. Since Lionel was young, he had not given up until he had everything he wanted. Lionel went into shock and panic at the same time, began to sweat like crazy and started making up excuses saying he didn't know what he was talking about. Upon hearing these excuses, the king called him an idiot and told him that it was enough. He began to turn his back on him, and with a confused look asked how he had ended up like this. He turned his back on him, and thought that Eren was more suitable for a ruler than he would ever be, adding that he no longer wanted to see him anymore. Lionel clenched his fist and his body began to tremble. He clenched his teeth tightly and gradually began to get angry. His eyes filled with rage since Eren Severus had ruined everything. Several minutes later, he began to head towards Eren's room, which was guarded by 2 guards. He gave them the order to move and then forcefully opened the door to her room. Upon seeing Lionel, Leximus panicked, and with a worried look she told him that Princess Eren needed to rest. He approached her, punched her hard in the face, and ordered her to move. Her body was thrown backwards, and she fell on her butt on the ground near Eren. While she had both hands on the ground, she closed her eyes and clenched her teeth due to the pain. Seeing this, Princess Eren, who was sitting in the chair, panicked. Lionel approached her and forcefully placed his hand on the table. Eren began to stare at him and fell silent. With a calm look, she asked him what all this was about. While he had his hand on the table, he began to approach her, started looking into her eyes and couldn't help but start smiling. Princess Eren remained calm, while on the other side, Lionel lost his composure, began sweating like crazy and told her that he had come to talk with his precious sister. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.